Hey, and welcome back to another video. And in this video, we're going to take a look at pop-ups in SwiftUI. So we're going to look at sheets, popovers, and full screen covers so we can actually see all the different ways that you're actually able to present views in your iOS applications as well. So pop-ups exist to provide our users information within our apps, and this could be a warning, confirmation, or just some more additional information that isn't on the screen. So what we're going to do is create a SwiftUI view that presents some kind of warning information so we can see how this gets treated in our three examples that we're going to look into. So first of all, let's create a new view called warning view. So now what I'm going to do is actually just type out some of the UI and then we'll break it down. So what we've got here is we've done an extension on our warning view, and a private extension because we don't want these views to be exposed. So we've got a warning icon, which you'll see on the screen in a second, and this is just an image using an SF symbol. And if you want to learn more about SF symbols, then check out my video, SF symbols in SwiftUI. And we're just setting the variant rendering mode and a font on it as well. And we can apply a font onto an SF symbol because it is technically a font. So what we're also doing here as well is we've got our title with some text just saying warning, and we apply a font onto that and some padding on the bottom. And then finally, we have some content, which is going to be our text below our title. And this is just using Lorem Ipsum, which is some dummy text. And we just set a font, and we also set a frame of our max width so we can make sure that our text doesn't actually exceed this width here because we don't want it to grow too big. So what we're going to do now is actually add these three into our body. So let's just scroll up, and then within our body, we're going to delete our text here. And then what I'm going to do is actually just do some more typing, and as usual, we'll break it down. Okay, cool. So now you can see our UI on the screen. So let's actually just break down what we've got here. So we've got ourselves a Z stack, and if you watch my video, stacks in SwiftUI, you should know that Z stacks allow you to control the position of views on the Z index. So our first view in our Z stack is our color blue, which gives us this background effect where it fills the whole screen nearly, except from the safe area, which we'll get onto later. And then we've got ourselves a V stack. When in our V stack, we've got our warning icon, which you can see here. And the reason why this is using the multicolor style is because if you look at our warning icon, we said that we wanted the rendering mode for the symbol to be multicolor, so we get this Apple system color for free. And then you'll see our title here and our content below as well. And then finally, what I've done is I've just added the multi-line text alignment, so all the text within it is within the center. And I've also added some padding around the view and just make sure that all the text in the view is white. So now we have our warning view. Let's now create a V stack with 3 buttons for each of the presentation styles that we're going to be looking into again. So I'm just going to go back into the content view. And then within the content view, I'm just going to type this out and then we'll break it down. So similarly again, we've got ourselves our private extension on the content view, and we've just created a property here for our button. So this is for our sheet example, which we're going to look at in a second. And we're using the new iOS 15 button styles to style this button. So if you want to learn more about this, you can check out my video, Button Styles and Materials in SwiftUI. And then we just got our V stack in here so we can see our example. So now that we're all good to go, the first example we're going to look at is the sheet modifier example, like I said. So when working with the sheet modifier, there's a few things it accepts. The main thing it needs is a source of truth to tell it when a value turns true, and it should trigger opening up the view in a sheet. So what we're going to do is build a source of truth using the state variable, and we're going to use it for as the first example. So let's actually just add this in now. So as you can see, we've got our state variable and we've marked it private, and it's a boolean because we want to decide whether the sheet is shown on our screen and if it's true or false. So this is what we're going to use as our sort of truth for this example. Now we have to actually attach our sheet onto some kind of view. So let's attach this onto our V stack, and we'll also type this one out together. So if you just go into your V stack, and if you just hit dot, and then if you just type out sheet, you should notice that you actually have 2 options here. Now, the option that we're going to look at is the is presented, because we want to bind whether our sheet is presented to some kind of boolean. We'll look at this other example later on in the video, but for now, just make sure you select this. And then what we're going to type in here is our showing sheet example. So you want to make sure that you use the $ before your property, because this is how you create a binding between this modifier and this property. So essentially what will happen is that whenever this gets triggered, it will change this sheet and show it, or if the sheet gets triggered and changes this value, this will be updated. So this just allows you to update and read the values from your source of truth. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have an action in here called onDismiss. So I'm just going to create an inline function to pass directly onto this that will print to the console. So let's do that now. So above here, we're just going to say private extension on content view. And then I'm just going to create a function called didDismiss. And then within here, we're just going to print to the console like so. So now, in order for us to use this function directly in here, we need to make sure that the function signature here matches the function signature here. So if you actually look at the two parentheses here, they actually are the same and match. So because of this, we're able to directly type it in like so. And then finally, we need to use our closure to pass in the view that we want to present if this is set to true. So in our case, that's going to be our warning view, like so. Okay, sweet. So now we've done that, we don't actually have anything to tell our sheet to be presented. So what we need to do is within our button here, we actually need to toggle the value for our source of truth. So inside of your button, if you just type out, it's showing sheet, and then what you want to do is you want to call the function toggle. So what this will do is it will change the value to the inverse. So if this is false, this toggle function would set it to true, and if it was true, then it will set it to false. Now, rather than using this function toggle, what you also could do if you wanted to is you actually could just set it directly to true, like so. But the reason why I'm just going to set it to toggle is because I know that when the sheet gets dismissed, it will automatically reset this value back to false for us. So now let's actually run this in our preview. So we just hit play, and if we just hit the sheet example, you should notice now that you actually get this effect where the previous view that you were looking at goes behind it almost like a card, and the view that you said you wanted to present is now on the screen. So you can see here our warning. And if you want to dismiss this, because you're using the sheet modifier, you're able to actually drag this down and it dismisses it. So when you actually drag it down, it's actually updating the value in here back to false. So if you want to learn more about how bindings work in terms of passing data between views, then check out my video Bindings in SwiftUI. So now we've actually looked into sheets. Let's actually see the difference with how this works with something like a full screen cover. So what we're going to do is add in another source of truth specifically just for our full screen cover example. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So as you can see, we've added that in. And the next thing we need to do now is we actually need to add in the full screen cover modifier so that we can see how it differs from this. So just go down here, and if you just hit dot on your keyboard and just type in full screen cover, you'll notice that the items that you pass into it are the exact same as sheet. But like I said before, we're going to look at this item example later. So for now, let's just focus on is presented. And then we're going to pass in a binding of the is simple showing full screen cover. So make sure you use this one here and not the simple sheet one, like so. On dismiss, we're going to pass in our didDismiss function. And then again on our content this time, we're going to pass in our warning view like so. So let's just clean this up. Cool. So now we've got our modifiers in, but we don't actually have anything that's actually going to toggle this value. So what we need to do is add in another button into our VStack. So let's do that now. So you can see we've got an exact same UI, but within our action, you can see that we're actually toggling our different source of truth. So this is our full screen cover source of truth. So now within our VStack, let's actually use our full screen cover screen simple example. And if we run this on the simulator now again, you should notice now that you should have two buttons. So let's actually see what happens here. So if we tap on full screen example, you'll notice that our screen goes on top of our view, but we don't get that card effect. And also, since we've done this, there's actually no way for us to actually dismiss this view similar to sheet. So with full screen cover, it's not the same as sheet, because what happens is it actually covers the whole screen, so you can't actually interact with it. Think about it almost like a sticker on your screen that you need to manually remove. So how can we fix the user not being able to close this screen? Well, in order to do that, we have two options. So the first option is we actually could pass in a binding to our warning view, and we could actually change the value here back to false, which would dismiss it. Or alternatively, rather than having to use bindings, we actually could use the dismiss environment value. So this environment value allows you to dismiss any screen that is currently presented in SwiftUI. But before we do that, let's actually make our warning view fill up the entire screen and cover the safe area. Now, I only want the warning view to actually fill the whole view and cover the safe area, specifically on this example. So what we're going to do is on our warning view, we're just going to add the modifier ignores safe area, like so. So if we actually run this again, because it's reset, and we hit the button, you'll now see that our warning actually covers the entire screen, like so. And let's actually see what this looks like on something like an iPhone 11. So we just change this to an iPhone 11, where it has a notch. And if we just go back into our example and we just hit full screen example, you'll see now, even it now covers our notch area, so the whole screen is now covered with our warning. Now, if you're someone who actually wants to do some kind of screen like this, where you want to prevent the user from using your app because maybe they need to wait for a app update, or maybe you need to do something where you have a maintenance mode within your app, then this is a valid option. But what we're going to do now is actually look at how we can add a button to the top right hand corner so that you can dismiss this screen. So let's do that now. So let's go into our warning view, and in our private extension we're just going to add in another view here. So this time we've got to add in a close button. So this time you can see here that I've used a button and I've set the label to be an SF symbol X mark, and I've just done some configuration on it. And what we want to do is we actually want to place this button in the top right hand corner here. Now what we could do if we wanted to is we could add in a H stack, and we could use Z stacks and whatnot, but rather than us doing this, I'm actually going to use the overlay modifier to just position this on the top right hand side of our Z stack. So let's do that now. So if you just go to your Z stack, and then at the end of it, if you just type out overlay, and then we want the option with the alignment and content. So for the alignment, we want this to be top trailing because we want it to be in the top right hand side, and then our content here should be close. So now you should see that you have a close button here. So if you actually look at our preview here, it's actually not taking into effect if the warning view covers the entire screen. So what I'm going to do is in our SwiftUI preview, we're just going to say ignores safe area, like so. And now you can see that our button is in the top right hand corner, but it's pretty high. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to push this down a bit more so that our view doesn't get lost in the notch area. So on our button, let's just specify here a padding specifically for the top and right hand side. So I'm just going to say dot top, and then we're going to set this to something like 50 to push it down more. And then we're going to specify another padding of top trailing, like so. So now we've only got padding on our top and trailing edges, and now you should see that our button has been pushed down more and it looks good on the notch device. Sweet. So how do we call dismiss and actually use this within our SwiftUI apps? Well, environment values hold a bunch of actions and properties that we can read in our SwiftUI apps, and we'll cover this in a later video when we actually create our own. So make sure you subscribe to the channel. There's actually two ways of handling this depending on the OS that you need to support, and I'm going to show you both ways. So let's actually do this now. So first of all, we're going to actually need to type this out in two ways. So I'm just going to actually type this out and then break it down. Okay, cool. So as you can see here, we actually have two environment values that we're reading from here, and we have this dismiss, and this dismiss here is the new environment variable that's available to us starting with iOS 15. And if you're someone who needs to support just iOS 15, then you can just use this. You don't actually need the second option I'm about to go through. But if you're someone who needs to support anything below iOS 15, then you're going to need to use this. So this presentation mode allows you to access the wrap value and then call dismiss. So now what we're going to do is actually add in this code. So depending on the OS that you're using, call the right action. All right, cool. So what we're saying here is that if this is available on iOS 15, then we want to call the dismiss action, or else if it's on anything below iOS 15, we want to use the presentation mode, access the wrap value, and then call dismiss on the view. Okay, sweet. So before we actually run this on our preview again and actually see how this works, there's something I just want to note. So there's actually a bit of a UI bug or inconsistency that we actually have here now. And if you actually look at our close icon, it looks fine on an iPhone 11. But if I was to change this to an iPhone 8, you'll notice that this is actually pushed down way too much. So now, in order to fix this, what we're just going to do is we're going to add in an extension to check to see if we're on a device that has a notch, or if we're on a device that is a normal phone, then we're going to change our padding. So let's actually just do this now. Okay, cool. So in order to fix this issue, I'm actually going to paste in a snippet that I use of my personal projects to check to see if the device has a notch or not. So just to briefly go over this, what's going on is we're actually getting the key window on the screen and we're checking to see if the safe area is greater than a certain amount. So if it's greater than 0, then we can assume that we're on a notch device. So now that we have these here, what we're going to do is actually use this within our padding. So we just scroll up. So on our close button, we're going to use a ternary operator to determine the padding depending on if this is a notch device or not. So we're just going to say UI device dot has notch, and then if it does have a notch, then we're going to add 50 padding, or else if it doesn't, then we're just going to add in 16 like so. So now if you hit resume, you should see that the close button goes back up into a nice position on an iPhone 8, and if we was to run this on an iPhone 11, you'll see that it's also in the nice position where you can easily tap it as well, where it's underneath the notch. All right, cool. So now that we've actually fixed that, let's go back into our content view and actually run this on the SwiftUI preview. So now if we hit this button, you should notice that it presents our whole screen, and now we actually have our close button here, and if we tap on that, you'll see that it actually closes the view because we call the dismiss function in the warning view. And if it's on iOS 14, it will call dismiss to dismiss it as well. What we want to do is we want to look at how we can actually work with popovers in iOS and what they look like. So let's actually add this in and see what effect we have. So let's add in a source of truth. And now let's actually add in the popover modifier. And you can see it's the same, except this time we now have additional options that we can actually use. So the option that we're going to go with is the one where you have all of the options to use for is presented. So we're not using item yet, we're just using is presented. So again, we're going to create a binding with our new source of truth here, like so. And then this time we have something called an attachment anchor. So the attachment anchor is the position of where you want your view to be placed. So I'm just going to say that we want this to be at the top. And then the arrow edge is the arrow of where you want the arrow to be positioned. So I'm just going to say here that we want it to also be on the top as well. And then finally, content, we're just going to pass in our warning view like so. And now we've got this set up, we need to actually toggle this source of truth. So let's actually add in a new button to do this. So now we have our button and it's toggling our source of truth. So let's actually add this button into our VStack. Cool. So now when you run this on a simulator, you should see it and you get a third button. So let's actually tap this and see what happens. So if you tap on this now, you'll notice that it's actually not changed the way that our view is being handled. I mean, it looks the exact same, but the only difference being is that it's not really taking into effect the safe area on the bottom. So what is the actual difference between this popover? Well, to see the difference, what you actually need to do is actually run this on an iPad. So if you just go to your project And then if you also want to use to support iPad, if you go to General and then make sure that iPad is selected, and if you just go back to our content view, if you choose an iPad simulator, so I'm just going to choose an iPad Air. So now that we actually have our iPad on the screen, if you actually run this now, and you just tap on popover example, you'll notice that this time we actually get a popover on the screen with our view within it. So when would this be useful? So if you're working on an iPad app and you need to provide users with like some kind of information when they tap on like the info icon, then this is when this may be useful. So what we're going to also do now briefly, if you just tap on this, you'll see that it actually removes the popover as well. And it also disables any other interaction on the screen because they're all kind of grayed out. So if you tap out the area, you'll see that it removes the popover too. So let's actually look at what other examples look like on iPad as well. So if I tap on full screen, you'll see that we get the same effect where it covers the whole screen. But this time, if I tap on sheet, you'll see that sheet actually looks different on iPad. It actually doesn't cover the whole, it doesn't cover most of the screen, and you also don't get that, card effect behind the view. Instead, it's almost like a card that's overlaid on top of the screen, and you can still drag it down to dismiss it, or we could tap on here to remove it as well. So you can see that depending on the platform that you're working on, you can get different types of presentation styles on iPad and iPhone. So you want to make sure that when you're working with your platforms that you use the right one that's suitable for your case. We're going to look at how we can actually handle stopping people from dismissing the view like a sheet. So we want to see how we can stop someone from doing this, where they can drag it down to dismiss it. So let's actually build ourselves a terms and conditions type of view where the user has to accept the terms and conditions before they can dismiss the screen. So what I'm going to do is just turn this back to an iPhone 11, and then we're going to create a new view called Terms Agreement View. And then similar to before, I'm just going to do some typing and then we'll break it down. So we've got ourselves our title with some styles, and this time we've actually got ourselves a scroll view for our content, and we're just using a for each loop here where we repeat this string 5 times. And then within this for loop, we've also got the text. And if you want to learn more about how to create for each and how it works with, scroll views and whatnot, then you should check out my video, Identifiable and For Each. And then finally, we actually have our agree to terms button here, which is going to be on the bottom of our screen. So let's actually add this into our view to see what all of this actually looks like. So what we actually have now is we have our title, as you can see here, and we also have our content and our button below. So if I actually run this on the SwiftUI preview, you'll notice that because we added this within a scroll view, we're actually able to interact and view all this dummy information that we added to our content. So what we need to do now is actually go back to our content view because we want to present this terms and conditions view when someone taps on a button. So let's say if someone taps on a button to try to, view the terms and conditions or, log in, or if you just want to trigger this on some kind of action, like someone logging in and you checked against the database to see if they've got the latest terms and conditions, this is what we're kind of going to simulate now. So let's go back into our content view. And then we're going to create a new source of truth for our terms and conditions. So let's do that now. So we've created our source of truth here, and it's called is showing terms because we want to dictate whether we are showing the terms on the screen or not using a Boolean. And then what we need to do is add in another button below our popover example for our terms and conditions. So let's do that now. Cool. So similar again, it's the exact same as before, except this time we're now toggling the is showing terms whenever someone taps on the button. So we need to actually add this into the VStack. So let's do that. So now you should see your terms example below here. And then finally, what we're going to do is we're going to use the same sheet modifier to present this terms view. So let's do that now. So we're going to do and then we're going to use again the is presented. So we're going to bind that to our is showing terms. This time we don't actually want the undismissed, so we're just going to remove that. And then we want our content, and then now we want to use our terms agreement view here. Okay, sweet. So now if we run this in the SwiftUI preview and tap on our button, you should see that your terms and conditions get presented, but you're able to actually drag this down to dismiss it. Now, I don't want you to be able to dismiss this unless you've agreed to these terms. So how can we do that? Well, in SwiftUI, there's actually a modifier you can use called interactive dismiss disabled. And what this allows you to do is what the name implies. You can actually disable interactions to dismiss it. So on our terms agreements view, let's add this. And then now if we run this again and test it out, you'll see that you're actually not able to dismiss this view. And even if we tap on the bottom, it does nothing. So this is good, but now our users are not able to actually exit this view. So what we want to do now is we want to actually give the user a way to actually, dismiss the view. And also as well, when they tap on that button again, because they've agreed to the terms, they're not stuck on the screen because they've already agreed to it. So what we need to do is create a new source of truth to handle whether the user has accepted the terms. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So now we have our new source of truth here. So now what we want to do is we actually want to pass in bindings into our terms agreement view. So the bindings we want to pass in is showing terms and has accepted terms. So let's go into our terms agreement view. And then we're going to create two bindings in our struct. Cool. So now we have these two bindings. And then we should get an error in our previews, which is fine. And we'll fix that by just providing them with some constants of false. Cool. And now what we want to do is within our button, if someone is seeing these terms and they tap to agree terms, we want to set is showing terms back to false because we want to dismiss the screen, and we also want to set has accepted terms to true because someone has accepted the terms and conditions on the screen. So let's scroll down to our button, and then within our action we're going to set is showing terms back to false by using toggle. But for our has accepted terms, we're not going to toggle this, we're going to explicitly set this to true because we don't want someone to be able to toggle this value. We just want this to always be true now from whenever the user is using our application. So now if we go back into our content view, you should notice that you get an error, and that's because we've not passed in these two bindings. So let's fix that now. So we hit fix on here, and on is showing terms we want to pass in this source of truth, and then has accepted terms we want to pass in that source of truth here. So now if we hit resume and run this, you should see that we can't drag it down, but if we hit agree to terms, it dismisses our view. But now if we reopen this again, we're still not able to actually drag this down even though we've accepted the terms. So how can we fix that? Well, now because has accepted terms holds true, because when someone taps on this button, we set this value to true. What we want to do is we want to actually set the value within the interactive dismiss disable to either true or false, depending on whether someone has accepted our terms or not. So let's actually do this now. So in this function, what we want to do is pass in here the bang has accepted terms. So what we're saying here is that if this evaluates the false, then we want to pass in that value so that you're able to actually drag this down. So if this looks a bit confusing to you, an alternative way of writing this is by just simply using the equal sign like so, like this. So again, what we're saying is that if this evaluates to true, so if has accepted terms is equal to false is true, then we don't want you to be able to drag this down, so it will pass true into this function. We just want to do this the shorthand way. So if we run this fresh now, and if you try to drag down, you'll see that you're not actually able to dismiss it. But if you tap on agree to terms, and then you reopen it, you'll see that now, because we've set this to true, you're able to dismiss it by dragging it down, or you can hit the button to dismiss it. So now we've gone through all the examples of is presented, and we saw how we can actually, stop users from being able to drag down our view manually. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at how we can actually pass in our own custom objects through these modifiers. So like you inputs. So like you saw before, you can actually pass in an item that actually conforms to identifiable. And let's see how we can use it by creating a new screen that users pass details onto. So let's create a new view called user info view. And now let's actually create a struct that actually captures our user's input in a new Swift file. So we're going to create a new file called user input view model. So make sure you select Swift file. And then I'm just going to do a bit of typing and then we'll break it down. Okay, cool. So what we have here is we now have our user info struct, which is what we're going to use to actually gather our information that we pass through our sheet, popover, and full screen modifier. And within this, we're making sure that our struct actually conforms to the identifiable protocol. And this is important because you'll see why we need that later on when we use our modifier. Then within our struct, we have our enum gender, which again is also a string identifiable and case iterable. And the reason why we're making this identifiable and case iterable is so we can actually add this into a picker that you'll see later. And then we have some properties for storing the name, last name, and gender. And then finally, what we have here is we have the ID, which will uniquely identify this user information that gets passed into our modifier that we'll work with in a second. And at the bottom, we've just simply got a static variable that allows us to quickly create an empty version of our user info if we need to. So now what we're going to do is actually create a source of truth for holding our user's information. So now we have our view model and its observable object, and we're using the publish property wrapper here so that we can observe the changes to this user information. And then we're actually setting this to an empty user, as you can see here with the static variable that we created before. So now what we want to do is we actually want to create a user input view that allows us to actually capture all this information. And so when we tap on a button, we're going to use the sheet modifier to pass it on to another view. So let's create a new SwiftUI file called user input view. And then within our user input view, we want to use our view model that we just created, and we also want to create our own source of truth for capturing and passing on the user's information. So let's do that now. Cool. So we have a state object here, which is what we use to create our source of truth for capturing our user's input from the text fields in picker that we'll create in a second. And we also have this variable here. And what this variable represents is it allows us to capture the input from our view model and actually pass this on to our sheet, which goes to our other view, which we'll use in a second. So now let's actually create some views and some UI to capture our user input from our view model. So I'm just going to type this out and then break it down. So now we have a VStack on the screen and we have two text fields. And you can see on both text fields, we're actually binding to the user struct that we had created before. And we're binding to the first name for this text field and the last name for this text field. So now whenever someone inputs within the text fields, we're going to be updating our view model. So you can see here within our picker, we're binding to our user's gender, and we're offering these values that someone can select based on our enum, which is identifiable, and case iterable, which allows us to access and use it on a for each loop like so. So now the for each will uniquely loop through all the possible genders and give you the options that you can present within the picker. And then finally, for the item, we're accessing the raw value and uppercasing it by saying that our enum is a string. And then last and not least, we just got a button here that we will use to pass data onto our other screen when someone finishes filling out our form. So if you want to learn more about pickers and text fields, then you should check out the videos in my SwiftUI sessions playlist that I'll have a link to in the description box and also at the top here. All right, cool. So now that we've got that set up, what we're going to do now is see how we can actually use Sheet with our own custom object. So below your VStack padding, let's just say dot sheet, and this time rather than using is presented, we're going to use the item option where it sets an identifiable object, and we're not going to use the dismiss because we don't want to really handle the dismiss. So let's just say the item, and then the item that we want to bind to is our new user info sheet. And then the content that we want to show here is our user info view. But for now, we'll just set the item, and we'll deal with that in a second. So just before we continue, what's going on here now? So what's essentially happening here is that what we're saying is that whenever our new user info sheet gets set with a value, this is going to trigger a sheet, and we can access the information from this property here. So what we need to do now in order to trigger this sheet is we actually need to set our new user info sheet to the user information from within our view model. So we just go inside of here, and if you just type out new user info sheet is equal to view model dot user. So what we're doing is we're grabbing the user from our view model and passing it into this info sheet to trigger it on the screen. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. So now what we're going to do is directly within our sheet, we're going to create a view where we can actually access this item, and we can also reset it by changing this here. So let's do that now. So now what we're saying here within the sheet is that we've got our VStack, and we're going to add in and access the information from our item. So now let's actually test this out. So we just start typing here any old nonsense and then hit submit sheet. You'll now see that we get our user information. But how can we actually dismiss this sheet when someone has finished typing in this information? Well, all we need to do is actually reset the new user info sheet and set this back to nil. So in our button, let's just say new user info sheet is equal to nil. And if we just try the same thing again, now you'll see that when we hit reset, it actually dismisses our sheet because our source of truth has been set to nil. So now that we saw how to do that on a sheet, what about if we want to do this on something like a, full screen cover? Well, we can easily do that by just using the same properties on the full screen cover. But before we do that, what I want to do, because we're going to be repeating ourselves a bit here, is I actually want to create a private extension with all of this logic within some kind of function. So let's do that now. Okay, cool. So now what we have here is we now have our detail user info function where we've got passing the item, which is the item from our sheet, which will build the views, and we're just going to reset it within this button. So now, rather than us having this VStack, we can actually replace this with the user info and then just pass in the item. So we can now use this function so that we're not having to repeat our code multiple times in our examples. So underneath our sheet, let's actually add in our other examples for full screen and popover to see how they react. Okay, cool. So we start from the top. We've now got two more new source of truths for full screen and popover, similar to our example before. And this time, rather than us having the buttons in the view directly, I've separated them out to the extensions that we'll get to in a second. So you can see our 3 buttons now. And then if you look at each one of our examples, they're all pretty much the same, except this time we're just using the different modifiers. So you can see on our full screen, we're binding it to the item, and we're using our user detail info function we created before, and same with popover as well. And if we just scroll down to our extensions for our buttons, you'll see that we have our 3 buttons, and they're just setting the view model each time they get pressed. So let's actually look at what each one looks like when you're interacting with it. Let's see what happens here. So now if we just run this and we just enter some nonsense in and we hit submit full screen, you'll see that we have our information and it's covering the whole screen. But if we hit reset, you'll notice that it's not actually working. And the reason why it's not working is because in our reset button, we're only resetting the new user info sheet source of truth. So we need to actually add in the logic to do this for the other 2 as well. So let's do that for the full screen, and let's do that for the popover as well, like so. Okay, cool. So now if we try that again, you'll see that if we hit reset, it dismisses it. And if we do popover again, it dismisses it as well. So that's it. We've covered all the options. So when do you actually want to use each one? Well, the general rule of thumb that I would follow is if you use sheet when you want to present a view that a user is able to dismiss, i.e. when you want to use the reminders app and you want to add a new reminder, the user isn't forced to do this. They can swipe down to go back to the previous screen. That's when I would use sheet. With full screen cover, you want to use this for when users where you want their full attention. So let's say you're trying to sell something in your app, like in-app purchases, and it makes sense for you to cover the screen, like the maintenance screen, then it makes sense to use a full screen cover because you want to grab their attention and make sure that they're aware of that information. For popover on iOS, it works the same as a sheet, but on iPad, you get like that view where it's over the existing control. So this can be useful if you're building an iPhone and iPad app where you need to display information about something like I don't know, you want to provide some more additional information about how a form works and you have an eye icon. If someone taps on this and use a popover, this is when this can be useful. So that's everything in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you left some feedback in the comment section below. Also as well, if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you gave the video a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to get updates whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you on a bit. Deuces.